when we think of our time, what's our time, right? My claim is that we have actually 3 different levels of temporality. So number one, when we can do this on a personal level, right? What's your time? And then my claim is we have 3 levels. Number one is the everyday level of time, of temporality and time experience. So for example, right now I'm 1 hour late, right? I'm very sorry. So I only have 10 minutes left. That's my everyday time, right? And that's a kind of time we struggle with on a daily basis. And normally we are very short on time here, very pressed for time. I mean, you can ask, who are we? Let's say in modern Western style societies. I have a very precise definition for this, but we can come back to this a bit later. But so that's the first level, right? And on this level of, that's a kind of everyday level of temporality where we normally experience time as scarce. Then there is another level, which I call the biographical level. So what's my time? I have 7 years left to go before there's the regular pension age in Germany, let's say, right? And so I have a kind of biographical perspective. What would I want to do afterwards? What did I do before? And so on, right? So there is this kind of biographical perspective, which we normally bring in either in times of transition. For example, when you just get your degree from the university or so, then normally we shift from the everyday level. You don't have to run to make it for classes or turn in your essays or so. But you think about, what should I do now with my time, right? With my lifetime. So the first level is everyday level of temporality. The second level is the lifetime perspective. And the third level is a kind of historical perspective. So what's our time? It's the time of the early 21st century. It's the post-COVID phase, the time of the Ukraine war, or the time of the Trump era, or the age of artificial intelligence and digitalization, right? So these are 3 levels of temporality which we have in our minds when we experience time. And the interesting thing is that there is a past, a present, and a future on all of these levels, right? So right now, I was running back from a meeting with a local municipality, for example. So that's the part, my immediate past on the everyday level. Right now, I'm talking to you. Hopefully, we have a little time left, right? And afterwards, I have to finish some paper. And you have something similar, right? So right now, you're in the webinar. Before you did something, afterwards, you will do something. And that's true from the lifetime perspective too, right? Before, you were maybe at a different university or in a different job or in a different degree. Right now, you're doing what you're doing, but in the future, you hope to have another job or live in another city, or maybe found a family or have kids or something of this sort, right? So there's a past, a present, and a future on this level too. And as I said, on the biographical level, it becomes relevant either in phases of transition or in times of crisis, right? When you feel that somehow, when you feel alienated, that's a term which I use for my analysis. Then you ask yourself, while you do your daily chores, right? What am I doing here? Why am I doing this, right? There's a break between the everyday level and the biographical perspective. Or there might also be a break between the lifetime perspective and the historical perspective. And of course, the historical perspective has a past, a present, and a future too. Right now, we are in the post-COVID phase, but there was a time of the Cold War, let's say, or the phase of neoliberal globalization. And the future might look very different, we feel right now in this age, right? So what do we have? 3 levels of temporality, 3 horizons of past, present, and future. Now, my claim is that for individuals, as for society, and particularly with our sense of history and historical movement, I think it's vital and very important that there's a sense of temporal integration. So what we do, I want to say that that people feel that actually they are feeling they have a good life, or that the time is okay, and they are at ease with their lives when there's a temporal integration over these 3 levels. That means what you do on a day-to-day basis, you work in the office or in the university or in the administration or in the factory, wherever, it makes sense from your biographical perspective, right? Because you are able to maybe buy a small apartment or create something for your kids, right? So it adds up to a lifetime perspective, and it fits with the historical perspective of the age you're living in. There is a novel I like to draw on, but it's a German novel. It's called Ein ganzes Leben, a whole life. And it's about a very simple person living in the Swiss mountains. And there is just one moment in his life where he has this experience. What he's doing, he's working for a a company that's producing cable car systems, will help him to found a home and have a family. He's just found a partner and is looking forward to have kids. And it fits the age. It's a part of the progress story of human civilization, right? So that's the kind of wholeness of temporal integration. The three horizons of past, present, and future somehow add up to each other. I would say they kind of create a sense of temporal resonance between the present and the future. And now my claim is that in our late modernity, we witness an increasing fragmentation and disintegration of the three temporal horizons. I could go on for another 40 minutes to substantiate that claim, that people feel that what they do for their everyday lives, for example, in bullshit jobs, right, doesn't really add up to a temporal perspective of a lifetime, and it doesn't add up to a kind of historical movement towards the future, right? So you see this very easily. I think the most drastic evidence is when people talk, or actually when we do social research, that you could really see that for a long time, particularly after the Second World War and almost all over the world, parents would say they are working hard, they don't have a lot, but their children will have a better life. So there you see this, and I think this is what modernity lives on, right? This sense we are working hard. Maybe they say we don't have much after the war, right? Or or it's in China or in Latin America. So a lot of people don't have a lot. We don't have much, but we hand over something to our kids. They will have a better life. We are moving towards a brighter future, and you could really see this. That because it was pretty pervasive, the idea the kids will have a better life. And we know that about actually the year 2000 is quite a good marker for reasons which we might discuss on the side. But after that, somehow something has changed. And now more than 70% on a global perspective say we have a lot, right? They don't say anymore, we don't have a lot, we don't have much. But a lot of them say, middle classes, of course, we have a lot, but our kids will have a worse life, right? Will deteriorate. We have to work as hard as we can for our kids to somehow preserve what we're having. So it's no longer what we do on a temporal perspective doesn't really add up to a meaningful a lifetime perspective and fit into a historical horizon. And you see this, for example, I call it desynchronization and disintegration. You see it, for example, that even if we are economically successful, interviews with managers are very interesting in the banking sector, but also in the industry. They say, well, right now we have a lot of profit and a lot of gains, if they say so, right? We are doing success, we are working successfully, but it won't last long, right? It can't go on for much longer because of the strains on the financial markets, but also because growth systems cannot go on forever. And there's the looming ecological crisis, right? So economic success, huge growth rates deteriorate the ecological crisis. And people have lost the sense of moving forward. That's what I call frenetic standstill, running faster and faster without moving forward. This seems to me to be a kind of a rupture and break, which leads to a historical experience, which I call frenetic standstill. I think I leave it at this point, and I hope that this gives some input for discussions. But I'm happy to hear your questions and comments anyway.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Hartmut. So I think what we'll do is we'll continue as planned for the full hour, if people are happy to stay. So we can hand over now to Nick, who'll be in discussion with Hartmut for some time. And then afterwards, we'll open up to Q&A from the audience. So whilst Nick and Hartmut are in discussion, if you'd like to be sending your questions via the Q&A box, we'll then deal with as many of those as we can in the final part of this session. So I'll now pass over to Nick.
Okay, well, thank you very much for those comments, and I'm happy you're here, and we'll just proceed.
Sorry,
and we've got a large audience, and they're keen for us to proceed. So, I'm interested that because you've addressed the questions of acceleration and resonance extensively already, but now it seems the temporality is the new element. These three levels of temporality and the kind of temporal dissonance, and the corresponding idea then of temporal resonance. And my question was, how might this be achieved? And one thing that prompts this question is a discussion you had during COVID with the late Bruno Latour. in which you said two things that struck me as very interesting. One is that you're anti-modern, and maybe we can come back to that. But the other one was that, COVID presents us with an opportunity to rethink our relationship to all sorts of things, the fundamental ways that modernity is constituted. It strikes me now, 5 years later, that, we not only failed to do that, but we didn't want to. We wanted to return to a normality, even though normality, so-called normality, is precisely the cause of our malaise and indeed of all kinds of social problems. So given that, that failed opportunity, how can you see temporal resonance then being established, given that, the pressure of acceleration continues and so on?
Yeah, I mean, this is why I sometimes say I'm anti-modern, but it depends a lot on what we mean by modern, right? I mean, I have I think a very clear structural definition. A modern society is a society which can only stabilize itself, reproduce its institutional structure on the mode of dynamic stabilization, which means it needs to accelerate to achieve economic growth and cultural innovation all the time, just to stand still, right? So that's the logic of a frenetic standstill, right? And I think this is the problem, right? I think we somehow need to overcome it, but we cannot simply. The question you ask, you could say, is more on the cultural side. How can we achieve a sense of resonance towards the future? But for me, I argue for I call it perspectival dualism. We need to somehow connect a structural understanding of modern society, what's the logic of this modern society, with a cultural understanding, for example, of the experience of time. How do we experience time? How do we move in time? And for me, the problem really is the logic of dynamic stabilization. And you could see it in the COVID crisis, really, because on the one hand, it was as remarkable, it was a spectacular slowdown, which we had not witnessed since the 18th century, right? As you just said. Because actually all the planes were grounded, right, for a lot of time. And there was, for a short period at least, a real deceleration. But the problem is that, of course, that was not really the solution, right? Because it created a lot of problems. Social life couldn't go on, as research couldn't go on, education couldn't go on, the economic systems, economic hardship set in. So you cannot simply slow down and leave everything else as it is. And while I was quite optimistic in the beginning of the COVID crisis, I thought, well, this could be an experience which really makes us rethink our historical stance also, and somehow maybe start anew. But if we actually take a view to history, which you know much better than I do, right? I think it's probably, I would almost say, the normal way of social life, of society as well as individuals, while you are in crisis, when the house is burning, right? What you try to do, of course, is to somehow to eliminate the flames, right? To get back to normal. So maybe that wasn't so surprising. I wonder why we seem to not have haven't learned anything from this, right? I thought after some time, I thought, okay, probably the normal way or the expectable way is, let's get back to normal, set the growth engines going again, and then take a step back and think, what was it exactly that we experienced, right? But we see, I think maybe the problem is that the crisis, of course, is not really gone, right? I mean, people, social actors, politicians, economists, but even civil society is still in a crisis mode. We have actually never left it, right? I mean, COVID was not yet gone while the Ukraine war started. And it's very interesting, for me, maybe you allow me to make this one point. I think it's a bit similar all over the world, but for Germans, really something happened through the Ukraine war. Our chancellor and actually all our media and all our parties agreed that it's a turning of times, right? It's a new age beginning. And I thought at first, this is very hypocritical, because there was war in Afghanistan, there was war in Iraq, there even was war in Yugoslavia, right? So it's wrong to say war has come back to Europe for the first time since the Second World War. It's not true. We had the Yugoslav war. But the one difference is that in the Afghan war, in the Iraq war, in the Russian war, in the Yugoslav war, the dominant discourse and the dominant perception always was, unfortunately, we still have some atrocities, right? Some forms of violence and war. But let's create a better system, a better European mechanism of the security system. Let's create a stronger United Nations so that in the future there will be a more peaceful world, pacification of existence, what Marcuse said, right? And when now our German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, says the tide has turned, right? He means it was illusionary. We will never create a peaceful world. Let's go. They all talk about getting ready to war in Germany, right? So there you see what I mean. We no longer have the hope, the vision, the idea of moving in the brighter future. But your question was, how do we recreate a sense of temporal resonance? I think we cannot simply create it or find it on a cultural level, right? It's not just a rethinking. I really believe what we need to do is to overcome this logic of dynamic stabilization, and therefore a kind of a shift away from the modern system, and I call it adaptive stabilization. My dream is to achieve a society which is able to accelerate, innovate, and achieve growth when we want to change the status quo in some respect of life. But we are not forced to permanently increase and grow just to maintain the way we are. But I don't think we can simply achieve a sense of temporal connection, a sense of moving towards a better world. And one last sentence because I haven't even talked about resonance. You know, for me, resonance is a different mode of being in time, you could say, being in the world. It lives on the idea of not controlling and dominating the world, but of listening and responding. And I really want to use this for a temporal perspective, for a historical perspective, listening to history and responding to it, feeling a sense of temporal connection, right? We are connected to those who came before us, and we are somehow handing over the torch to those who come after us. And it doesn't mean we have to be true to our ancestors. When you are German, you wouldn't want to do that, right? So listening and answering might include a no, right? Let's do it differently from the ancestors. But recreating a sense of temporal connection seems to be very important for me.
Maybe if I could follow up with that. I mean, you said that, there can be a need to say no to certain kinds of temporal resonance. And that's something that Andres and I were talking about before you joined us, and that was the rise of populist and far-right movements now throughout Europe, but also in America and so on. And do those represent a kind of attempt to establish a temporal resonance precisely in the face of alienation, even though it's often a kind of projective relationship to the past, or it's a kind of fantasy that's projected into the past in order to legitimize movement in the present? But
yeah, I would definitely say so. I mean, in my interpretation, this is what we call right-wing populist movements, also let's say Trump or the alternative for Germany in Deutschland, but also the Brexit supporters, or I'm not sure UKIP is no longer called UKIP. They have a different name now, right? Nigel Farage.
Reform Party, it's called.
Reform Party, exactly. Yeah. I think they live on this. They live on this on the yearning for resonance, and also on a promise for resonance. Let's reconnect with the past and thereby gain a sense of a future we want to strive towards. Look, I mean, when you look at the political spectrum, I think the problem really is that that political parties, actually from left to right, only offer us different versions of the apocalypse. Right? We're in Germany. We're in the middle of the electoral campaigns. Right? There will be a vote in 2 weeks. And if you're a supporter of the Green, then the most likely future is ecological disaster. We are fighting ecological disaster. If you're on the far right, we are fighting an immigrant crisis and the loss of German identity and so on. If you're a liberal or a Christian Democrat, then we are fighting economic downfall. Germany is on the verge of disaster and decline. And if you're a social democrat, you want to get ready for war with Russia. So as a voter, you have the choice between different apocalyptic scenarios, right? So against this, in some sense, there is this yearning for a past, and you're absolutely right. It's not even a past that ever existed, but it's the idea there once was a time, right, that we feel connected to, that we want to be true to, and that we want to hand over to the next generation. So I do agree. It's a kind of desperate attempt to take back control. I mean, that was the slogan of the Brexit campaign. I found that very interesting, right? I think what's dominating is the sense of a loss of self-efficacy. People feel we are no longer connected in a self-efficacious way to the world and to the future. And those right-wing populists promise, yes, you can gain control and therefore, and then reconnect to history and hand over something to your children. But for me, it's very important to see, of course, that this doesn't really work, because I mean, I interpret this as a kind of echo relationship instead of a resonance relationship. It's the idea to be completely true to either a nostalgic and kind of imaginary past, right? And then it's no chance that they call themselves identitarian sometimes, right? It's the idea of affirming and keeping pure a certain identity. And this is what I call echo relationship. Let me make this one point, which I found very instructive. When Donald Trump accepted to be the nominee for the running for president in the 2016 electoral campaign, he made a very forceful speech where he said, you in the Detroit who are never heard, you in the Rust Belt, long forgotten, right? You in the Deep South who are totally without any representation in Washington. Now I am your voice, right? And this idea, I am your voice, for me is a promise of resonance. You will be heard, you will be reconnected, right? But interestingly, it's a promise of resonance, but it's also a denial of resonance, because he does not say, I make your voice heard. I give you a voice which can connect with other voices. He says, I am your voice. There will only be one voice, and that's my voice, and everything else needs to silence, right? So all the differences are cut down. So for me, it's important. Resonance is listening to some other voice, to some difference, and thereby being transformed. So I would agree with you. It's the attempt to recreate resonance, but it's a failed attempt. It's an echo relationship.
Yeah, and I think your points about the identity thinking there, quoting Adorno towards the end of your book, The Uncontrollability of the World, are very relevant in that respect.
Yeah, for me, that is very important. I just had an interview with someone who asked about my connection to Adorno, and I stressed exactly this point, right? The non-identical, to keep a sense for this is very important.
Andres, do you want to join in, or do we have other questions?
Yeah, so we have plenty of questions lined up, actually. So perhaps we can move to taking some of these questions from the audience. So let's begin with this question here. So there's a question about dissonance, and it's from Su Ming, who says, I have a question about how the theory of resonance deals with dissonance, as it seems quite focused on consonance. So perhaps you could elaborate, Hartmut, a little bit more on how dissonance is working within your theory.
Yeah, I'm very happy to leave it to you to select questions, right? Because there's a question and answer thing, and there's this main there's the main chat, so I'm kind of lost. But thanks for the question on dissonance. For me, this is very important, right? And really, I mean, number one, it's, you know, a lot of people, there's even a book called Resonance and Dissonance, where authors make the claim that dissonance is just as important as resonance. But for me, that's the wrong opposition, right? The opposition of dissonance is consonance, right? And resonance is right in between. It has to do with what I just tried to say about the echo, right? I mean, for me, a resonant relationship is not, I hear the same back. It's not unity or harmony. That's very important. Resonance is a connection to something that's different. I mean, in today we speak about temporal connection, right? So it's not to simply continue the past, right? It's listening to a time which is different and answering in your own voice or your own key, and thereby producing something new, what Hannah Arendt calls natality, right? For me, this is really a very important idea, that by listening to something that's, listening is metaphorically speaking, right? Resonance is, there is something out there speaking or sounding in a different key or a different frequency, but you allow it to touch yourself, to sound, right? To resound. and then to answer it, and there can be a connection. It's like in a discussion, right? If you all agree, yeah, that's great, then it's not resonance. It's actually, it might feel good. Everyone agreed with me, right? But resonance is if you speak, if you have a different idea, right? If you come up with very different ideas, and then it's listening and answering. And in this process, we are transformed. So for me, the resonance idea is it's the promise, the hope that you can build a bridge towards the non-identical, the different, right? The alien, but only at the price of transformation. You will not stay the same in this process, right? So for me, there needs to be an element of dissonance, of non-sameness, of non-identity to allow for a resonant relationship. But if there's only dissonance, there's also no resonance, right? Because then it leads to kind of repulsion or alienation in the sense of, I don't understand that at all, right? There's nothing, it doesn't touch me, it doesn't speak to me, right? So resonance, I claim, is exactly in between consonance and dissonance. It needs both and sets in motion a dynamic and a transformation, right? So it's exactly between identity and alterity.
Thanks. So we have another question from Tara. This is a great question. I'm wondering about the temporality of thinking. AI is proposed as fast thinking, particularly in terms of processing and overload vis-a-vis information. Do humans have a limit to the speed of thinking? The time of thinking seems to be a tremendous casualty of acceleration.
Yeah, I tend to totally agree with that. I was always against, I was always skeptic of the AI processes, because I actually, because of, or let me start on the other hand, I totally agree with what you're saying, right? About I think information processing, of course, might be maybe we can speed that up, but maybe not in our brains, but with the help of artificial intelligence and also memory capacities and so on. But for me, really the vital aspect of you could say of thinking, but I would actually say of human life, of mental life, right, is what I call, actually I have there is a German distinction which you cannot really make in English, so I'll try in German at first. We distinguish between aneignen. They are both appropriation, right? One is called aneignen, the other is called anverwandeln. So basically both are appropriation, right? But the second term, unverwandeln, means it's appropriating it in a way that somehow transforms myself, right? So you can really say, when you read a book, right, the first form of appropriation, I call it sometimes instrumental appropriation, means I know exactly what the book says. I can tell you what the author says. I can tell you when let's say when the novel was written, right? I can tell you about the style. I can recount the plot and so on. So I've appropriated it in an instrumental way. The second form, I call it transformative appropriation or Anverwandlung, is when I allow the book to transform myself, right? Sometimes we read books, it might be novels, or it might be philosophical or historical or scholastic investigations. Then we appropriate them in a way that it transforms our identity, our way of thinking, our whole being, actually, right? You could call it also constitutive appropriation, and this is necessarily time consuming, as processes of resonance. I claim resonance has 4 elements. The first is something speaks to me, it's affection. The second is self-efficacy. I'm capable to reach out and connect and do something with it. I feel alive in this moment. That's something Bruno Latour writes. And then it transforms me, right? I don't stay the same in such a process of resonance. But the fourth is uncontrollability. And that means you cannot, as you say, I cannot indefinitely speed it up. Maybe I can't speed it up at all. We all know this. If you have a hard text by Adorno or someone else, then we sometimes might struggle with it for a few weeks, and then it transforms us in a non-controllable way, right? Because if you start reading something that really has a lasting impact on you, no one can predict what it will do to you and what you will do with it, right? So clearly this form of appropriative transformation, this form of thinking, takes time. And for me, the important thing is it's this resonant moment that creates the new, that allows for natality in the sense of Adorno or Hannah Arendt. And therefore I'm pretty skeptical about this AI processes. But on the other hand, let me finish that point with this remark. I thought right now we are back to war and the plague, right? The problems we have right now in our world, in England, in Europe, and all over the world, is the war is back, and the plague, right, is back, the pandemic, right? So these are troubles for mankind, at least for thousands of years, really. So we haven't made a single move forward, despite all our wisdom and our political capacities. So I think, well, maybe, but on top of that, we have the nuclear threat and the ecological disaster. So maybe it's not so bad if AI takes over and creates something completely new. But from a resonance theoretical perspective, I would say the question is exactly right.
Could I follow up with that on the question of AI? And that is, doesn't AI represent a kind of threat to the possibility of resonance, in that it's precisely a system that's based on likenesses, on similarity, and therefore tends to produce echoes rather than it reinforces the same rather than identification with another. And so with the proliferation of AI, and indeed all kinds of other algorithmic systems that you find in social media, don't the possibilities of resonance become fewer or harder to attain, precisely because we're always getting more of the same, and we're separated into our pre-existing groups or communities?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think I wanted to exactly hint in this direction, because so what's lost is this, or what we should be afraid of is that what is lost is exactly this element of natality, something completely new, because the algorithms somehow they live on what's already there, right? They compile it in a different way. Even though we discussed this a lot in my university in Jena in particular, right, but also in Erfurt. And some people say, and maybe, it might be that we just transform our creativity, because it's actually true. It depends a bit on the prompts you give to, let's say the chatbots, right? If you prompt them by asking them to combine something that has not been combined before, there might still be a kind of a moment of innovation. So there might be creativity and innovation, but basically I would agree with you. That's what I say in these discussions. I think AI might be intelligent, it might be creative, it might even come up with something new, but it cannot be it cannot resonate. That's what I really claim, and I think it cannot resonate because it can't. I would say machines, computers, right? They cannot fear, and they don't have desires, right? Fear and desire, which is a kind of moving force for also for processes of resonance, right? So yes, I would share both these concerns. Number one, it seems that algorithms reduplicate what is already there, right? They create echoes, even so sometimes surprising echo effects. And number two, it seems to me that it's not resonance, because you need an agent, a kind of agent in a well, you would assume in a human sense, at least in some form of life. But well, in the end, I think it depends a bit. I really want to come up with a new theory of agency. I want to say resonance requires that on the other side there is something which we perceive as an agent, something speaking to me in a meaningful way, and I cannot see that an algorithm could do this, right? But well, we don't quite know yet what will happen.
I wanted to jump in with a question of my own, which in a sense connects with this, because I was thinking when you were talking about these three temporal levels, and sort of what happens when they go out of sync with one another.
Yeah.
I was wondering whether we might also think about changing patterns in which one of those three levels maybe perhaps becomes the dominant one. I'm thinking if perhaps a previous phase of capitalist accumulation, or of the history of capitalism, was more defined by the kind of biographical, the individual life story becoming the dominant one. I wonder if the case could be made that we're now in a phase where it's really the much more immediate temporal form, which is the dominant one. If you think about how wrapped up people are in social media, in this kind of constant connection, and the restlessness of always being online, always updating, always receiving new information, always being active. If maybe this kind of very immediate form of temporal consciousness becomes the dominant one and starts to eclipse the others.
I think that that's right. I mean, it's the kind of, when I try to distinguish pre-modern from modern and late modern temporalities, it has to do with the speed of social change and with the speed of social life also, right? And I would agree with you. It has somehow changed from a kind of almost intergenerational perspective where the world basically stays the same, right? If the father is a baker, then the son is a baker, and even the grandson is still a baker. And there's a kind of at least, of course, there were always historical breaks, and people knew that there could be breaks. But the idea was then to kind of establish, or it's like what Reinhard Koselleck says, right? It's kind of stories of change within a kind of non-moving history. I mean, what I like, I had this idea, which I'd love to discuss with you, that it builds a bit on Reinhard Koselleck's conception of the saddle time, right? Because he says in pre-modern times, there were stories, of course, of wars and of famines and of hunger or whatever it was, right? So there was change in the world. But nevertheless, when the grandmother talks to the grandson, she would say, look, kid, the world is like this. In the world, you have to count on or to reckon with the possibility of a war or a plague or something. It's the world. While modernity lives on this temporal conception of a moving history, where the grandmother would tell the grandson, look, kid, at my age, it was kind of inconceivable to live a gay life, let's say, right? But in your age, that seems to be completely okay or so. So it's the sense history changes. It moves through generation from my time and your time is different, right? While in my view, in late modernity, we have reached a stage where actually the grandmother would again say to the grandson, look, right now we have Trump. Nobody knows what will happen in the next 2, 3, or 5 years, right? So it's now, I call it intragenerational pace of change. And I think it is very important to understand, to really see this, that capitalism really built on this conception of a moving history. Look, I talked to colleagues in Chile, right, in Santiago, who said even Pinochet's Chile, of course, was very much based on a kind of family horizon, right? The idea was to become rich for those who kind of supported the neoliberal policy there, but it was the idea to build something for future generations, right? And it really seems that we have lost this sense, and now people are struggling on a day-to-day basis. And let me make this one point, because I find it very important. I think it's the same problem in the US, in the UK, and in the rest of Europe. There seems to be a crisis of work. The baby boomers want to get out of work as fast as possible, right? The generation Z doesn't seem to not want to get into the full, doesn't want to be fully integrated in the labor market. They want to work only part-time, or it maybe not a top-notch job, just to have a life besides the job. And even and apparently even a rising number of women doesn't even want to enter the labor force at all. And this, for me, has to do with this sense that it's no longer through work, through labor, that we connect with the future, with the whole of society, with future generations, right? So people are looking for resonance outside the labor market. And this has to do, I think, with what you said. The stress is now on everyday temporality. And so, yes, I would agree with this. Maybe it's an interesting thought. We could kind of recount the story to say, we moved from an historical consciousness to kind of generational consciousness, and maybe now to the dominance of an everyday consciousness. But one more remark. There never was complete synchronization or complete integration. I think it has always been a struggle, right? I mean, I think through all the ages, it's only, I think it's the hope that we might manage to integrate those 3 levels, right? I think most of the time, people, of course, feel that the everyday life is not really adding up to a meaningful biographical life, and it's not really fitting with the historical context, but it's always the hope. I think life is okay if people have the hope that there could be a reintegration, and it seems that a lot of us have lost that right now.
So we have a question from Emily, which is, could let's go back to normal be a stable state? We often say this in everyday life when we lack the time, the resources, or control to complete our work properly.
Well, I think I really think that this sense of normality is kind of illusionary, right? I mean, this is I really actually I think a lot in our society is really hinging on, it depends on this sense. I mean, let me give you a very easy, very simple example. I mean, very often I bet in your administrations, the university administrations, right, there's quite a lot of chaos right now. Why? Because they have new softwares, new regulations, new laws, probably, right? So the hope is always, once we get back to normal, we will be able to do our do our work properly, right? And it's not just in the administration; it's very similar in the whole of the business and for students too, right? And the problem is we will never get back to that normal, because once we get used to the new software or the new regulations, they will be changed again, right? I mean, the thing here, it's I mean, I could go on about this for hours too, right? I mean, when I just finished my studies, right, there was the study course, the regulations for a study course were kind of, they had been on for 50 years, and then we decided to have a committee to rethink a reform of the students of the curriculum, for example, right? But we thought we would do this one time, and then we will dissolve the committee. Now we have turned that committee into a standing committee, right, to make the reforms and the changes every year and every term, right? So in a society, that's my brief and hopefully precise answer. In a society that lives on the mode, or that is based on the mode of dynamic stabilization, there is no normal in the sense of stability, right? We need change, acceleration, innovation, growth incessantly to maintain the institutional structure. So yes, this normal has been an illusion anyway, and you see it. You see it. I think this is probably why we have never gotten to the point where we could relax, stand back, and look at the COVID crisis, because we're still in an ongoing crisis. Modernity is the crisis, like Walter Benjamin said, right? The catastrophe is that it goes on in the mode of normality.
Can I raise something that you talked about university administrations and software programming? That's absolutely true. At Oxford, it's a nightmare. You know, as soon as we've got one failed system, then if we've mastered that, or we think we've mastered that, and it's replaced with a new one that's even more complex and more problematic. So, but related to this, because I'm a member of my college's governing body, and one of the things we have to do for our insurers, for the charity board, et cetera, for the government, is produce elaborate risk registers with a rating, you know, high risk, medium risk, and we try to anticipate every possible risk that the college will face. This doesn't necessarily make us any better prepared for risks, but it creates the illusion that somehow we're controlling the future by trying to anticipate every kind of risk. And I find that it's fascinating. It's very time wasting in meetings, I have to say, but it's a fascinating phenomenon, because the idea is if you put a chart on this anticipating all of these, you can somehow control the future. And that it reflects this anxiety precisely about all the things that we can't control, but feel compelled to try to control.
Yeah, but look, I mean, I think this was an insight which I got very late in the process of writing the book on uncontrollability, right? It was, I mean, the claim there is that this modern logic of dynamic stabilization as an institutional structure of modern society is firmly connected to, tightly integrated with a cultural logic of trying to increase controllability, right? To make the world available, attainable, accessible, to reach control over the future. But by trying to do this, we have created what I call monsters of uncontrollability, right? It's really, and I found this when I got this. It's the last chapter in the book, and I found it eye-opening for myself, because, you know, I'm not sure when you started this committee on risk assessment, right, or this regulation, but I assume they neither had the COVID crisis nor the Ukraine war probably high on their lists, right? So actually, you see, we can. It's an illusion to think we can create the world. My claim is that we have created monsters of uncontrollability, and bureaucracy has itself become a monster of uncontrollability, right? It has made processes so uncontrollable, right? Because you never know which kind of law, regulation, or change in the laws or regulations, or actually now administrative staff. In many places, administrative staff no longer is capable of doing the routines, right? So we have created uncontrollable monsters. It's really true. These regulations, these forms you have to fill out. I mean, just to give a lecture somewhere, you have to fill out 10 pages of forms. That's a monster of uncontrollability, because you never get the evidence for this, right? So for me, look, this is the problem of our age, right? It's the claim we can control the future, which fails, right? Resonance is not based on the idea of controlling the future. It's a different sense of self-efficacy. It's the self-efficacy which says, I don't know the future, I don't control it, but I have trust that I will be capable to handle it, to answer it, to find ways to live with it. For me, this is very important also on an individual level. Look, right now, all over the world, it's really true, with some exception in African countries, which actually I'm quite happy about. But apart from that, burnout rates are really at record levels, particularly with young people. And it's not simply a discursive or diagnostic artifact. There's really something wrong with the mental health of youngsters, of high school students, of university students, right? And the question is, what is wrong? And you see, burnout for me is the paradigm case of alienation. When you feel you're frozen in time, right? You can no longer connect to what came before and to a future you want to move towards. It's exactly this break between the temporalities. And when I talk to young people, because I'm really working on this and now having also empirical research, and my finding is really what you could really say with university students, probably also at Oxford, what they have lost is lust for life, interestingly, right? Just the burning lust to kind of to throw yourself into the world, even though it's uncontrollable, right? It might be irrational and unreasonable, but that has always been a feature of youth, right? To throw yourself into life, but also trust in life. And trust in life, a trust which is not based on control, but based on a sense of self-efficacy, on the capacity to connect and control. So I think this risk assessment thing is, I would say, clearly bound to fail.
So we have another question from Jan, which is, I'm curious about your conversations with thinkers, not necessarily academic, outside Euro-American locations, and how their perspectives have informed your thinking about time and conceptions of temporality.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I love to talk to people outside of Europe and outside of the box. But I mean, on the one hand, I would say there is a kind of almost global middle class phenomenon, right? This logic of dynamic stabilization we really find beyond Europe too, right? When you talk to people, I must say that I was a little shocked to realize or to receive the strong affirmative responses in Brazil, for example. In Chile, I was just in Chile, right? People really say this frenetic machine, and also the sense of frenetic standstill is very much shared by themselves, kind of on a collective societal level. I almost diagnose a kind of collective burnout, that we no longer, not just as individuals, also as societies, don't seem to have the energy to move somewhere. And even in China, I mean, in China, it's quite interesting. They really picked on this acceleration story. They have Chinese terms for this, of course, but this kind of frenetic standstill is very well known as a phenomenon and discussed by youngsters, right? And in South Korea, for example, when you look at university students, for example, right, the pressure on them is extreme, and it's very similar to ours. I mean, they have this kind of very strange invention that you can go to a prison, a kind of mock prison, and a lot of students really go there and say, because then you're really locked up, right? Without having even committed a crime, you're locked up for, let's say, 2 weeks or 4 weeks or so. And then people and students say, and not just students, also other people from the middle classes, it's the only place in time where I can feel free. And this is so absurd, right? When I'm locked in, I feel free. But I think I can completely explain it because this frenetic running, right, is the treadmill is because of expectations we feel they are made on us, which are legitimate. Yes, I should do this, I should do that, I should go there, I should fulfill this. And only when you're locked up, no one can legitimately expect that from you. So people feel free. So that was the first part of the answer. The phenomenon is fairly widespread. But what's interesting is the alternatives to it, right? Other conceptions of connection to time, other conceptions of the good life. When we are, for example, in Latin America, but also in India or China, and this is where I want to work now. Of course, they don't really stick so much on our sense. I mean, they are a bit infected by our sense, but there is an alternative to the sense of control over the world, right? A more of a participatory, of a tuning in. My latest project now is working on a conception of social energy, because I think there's something wrong with the interesting thing is that in the social sciences we do not have a concept of social energy. We either have physical energy or it gets totally esoteric, right? While in all the other countries or cultures, in China, in India, in Africa, when you read Mbembe or Suleiman Bashir Dian, they say a conception of energy, life energy or so is their starting point. And when you start from a kind of collective energy in which you tune in, then you get a completely different sense, not just of you can replace the conception of control over the world, but you also get a different sense of temporality, which, for example, goes with a strong sense of connection to ancestors. And then it's no longer this linear line from the past to the future, but more of a circular form of temporality. So there's a lot to learn actually from these countries. But the problem of frenetic standstill is experienced all over the world now.
Great. So the building I'm in is actually about to close. So I think
sorry,
we're gonna have
I'm
to wrap
sorry.
up quite soon. But what
Yeah.
I'll do is I'll take one more question that we've got from the audience, and then if I have to run, then perhaps Nick can wrap up. So this is from Damaris, who asks, "What's your concrete vision for an optimistic future that can inspire people beyond the disastrous ones we're currently offered?"
You know, I always said that I'm an optimist and not a pessimist, but I must say that, you know, the COVID crisis, but even more what I said about our chancellor, that he says we no longer should dream of a peaceful world, we need to get ready for war. This somehow pushed a button in me or made a break, and I said, okay, now I'm pessimist. I must say that I'm not very optimistic when I think of the immediate contemporary political and economic and other states of the world. But I do have some optimism by what we started in the beginning. My claim is that human beings are, by their very fabric, by their nature, you could say, resonant animals, right? We need, when you actually do child-infant research, you realize that the first thing the newborn baby even does, it's needing resonance, someone caressing him or her, right? But then very quickly the eyes which seem to speak to him or her, and then the discovery of one's own voice and eyes, which is capable of reaching out and connecting. So I think the basic capacity to get into a resonant mode towards others, towards social life and towards the world is inbuilt into our human fabric, so we will not lose it. And I think the fact that we do suffer burnout and political frustration, which we see all over the world, is an indication that there is something at work in individuals and in societies which is aiming for and yearning for a different age. And I think my own conception of uncontrollability explains that we do not quite know. I do not have a blueprint or a plan of what the future may be. But if Hannah Arendt is right, that out of processes of resonance, natality means we are not forced to continue along the lines we have continued so far. We have the capacity to start anew. So that gives me some hope. And then I have an idea of what the future vision world might be like, because I distinguish 4 axes of resonance. One is between human beings, it's in love, in friendship, but also in politics. My claim is democracy only works if citizens in a Republican mode encounter each other in a resonant mode. I want to hear you, even so if you have a different opinion. So that's axis number 1, social resonance. Axis number 2, material resonance. We have physical embodied being, and I believe in Karl Marx there. Working in the material world, right, is a form of resonance for human beings. The third axis is self-axis of resonance. We need to develop a sense of resonance with ourselves, with our psyche or our soul, with our memories, with our biography, be in a mode of resonance instead of control, right? And finally, a resonance towards the encompassing sphere, the totality of the world or of life. So I dream of a future society which opens up axis of resonance in the social axis, in the material axis, in the historical axis, and in the natural axis. And that's a basic idea which still gives me hope amidst very bad, disastrous times.